Ready? Let's begin. Skeletal anomaly. In 1928, during Leonard Woolley's excavations at the Royal Cemetery of workers clearing a burial shaft in the deepest excavated level of the site sent a set of bones to the surface that stopped the expedition's physical anthropologist mid-sentence. The bones were not broken. They were not diseased. They were simply built in a way that did not match any documented human population the team had ever studied. The Royal Cemetery of is already one of the most extraordinary archaeological sites in human history. Over 2,000 graves, golden death masks, lapis lazuli headdresses, and the haunting evidence of mass sacrificial burials where entire courts followed their kings into death. Woolley published all of it immediately, with the precision and enthusiasm of a man who understood he was handing the world something it had never seen, which makes what he left out so difficult to explain. The skeletal remains in question showed bone density estimated at 40 to 60% beyond the normal human range. Not as a result of acromegaly, not consistent with gigantism, which produces characteristic joint enlargement and facial distortion. Not consistent with any metabolic disease the team could identify. The limb-to-torso ratios did not match any known human population, living or ancient. And crucially, the bones showed no pathological markers at all. They were not deformed. According to the morphology, this individual had simply been built this way, naturally, from birth. What Woolley's field notes reference as non-standard remains, his official published reports omit entirely. In archaeology, what gets excluded from the record is a decision, not an accident. Woolley was meticulous. He cataloged every bead, every cylinder seal, every fragment of inlaid wood from the death pits. The absence of these remains from his published work is not an oversight. It is a choice, and choices like that have reasons behind them. The bones were real enough to note in the field, and significant enough to suppress in print. When the scientist who finds the evidence decides not to publish it, the silence becomes its own kind of data. Woolley gave the world the golden treasures of What he kept from it may have been stranger than anything he showed. Enlarged bones. In 1889, a University of Pennsylvania expedition, digging through the ancient Sumerian city of Nippur, broke through the floor of a temple precinct and found a burial chamber that was not on any architectural map of the site. No one had marked it. No one had planned for it. And the individual inside it had not been built to a standard human scale. Nippur was not simply another Sumerian city. It was the spiritual capital of the ancient world, home to the temple of Enlil, king of the gods, the city through which divine authority over all of Sumer was legitimized. Every Sumerian ruler who wanted to be recognized as legitimate had to receive the blessing of Nippur's priesthood. To find an anomalous burial beneath the temple precinct is not like finding a strange skeleton in a field. It is like finding one beneath the altar of a cathedral, accompanied by a signed document, in a language no one has finished reading. The expedition, led first by John Henry Haynes and later by Hermann Hilprecht, documented a femur length estimated at between 24 and 26 inches. The normal human range sits between 17 and 20 inches. The individual had been interred with ceremonial objects, including cylinder seals and a clay tablet bearing cuneiform inscription. Cylinder seals in Sumer were administrative tools, the equivalent of a signed royal decree. Their presence in an unmarked sub-temple burial signals deliberate, official commemoration of whoever was inside. The skeleton was cataloged and transferred for institutional storage. The cylinder seals were accessioned without comment. The cuneiform tablet found beside the remains has never appeared in a published transliteration. The reason given across decades of inquiries is condition. A clay tablet, 4,000 years old, held in a climate-controlled collection for over a century, should not be too fragile to read. If this was simply an unusually tall human, a rare but documented biological outlier, the cylinder seals would need explaining. The unmarked chamber beneath the city's most sacred precinct would need explaining, and the tablet that has never been published would need explaining most of all. In Sumer, cylinder seals did not accompany the ordinary dead. They authenticated the significant ones. Fused remains. Eridu is the beginning. The Sumerian king list, the oldest historical document in human existence, names it as the first city, the place where kingship first descended from heaven to earth. In 1995, a UNESCO-affiliated documentation survey working near Eridu's excavated ruins in southern Iraq encountered a set of skeletal remains that no physical anthropologist on the team could classify. Not because the bones were damaged, because they had grown together in ways that human bones simply do not. Before the discovery, the standard model of ancient Mesopotamian human remains was well established. Thousands of skeletons from Sumerian sites had been studied across more than a century of excavation. The range of human variation was understood. Pathological conditions, from arthritis to congenital deformities, had been documented across dozens of burial sites throughout the region. The team at Eridu was not expecting a mystery. They were expecting a survey. The vertebral fusion in the specimen extended across 11 consecutive vertebrae. Standard pathological fusion, the kind caused by ankylosing spondylitis or severe spinal trauma, typically affects 3 to 5. But it was what was absent that made the case impossible to resolve through conventional pathology. There was no inflammatory scarring anywhere in the fused region. Inflammatory scarring is the biological signature of disease-driven fusion. Without it, the fusion was not the result of illness. It appeared to be structural, meaning the spine had been built this way. Additionally, the skull exhibited basilar invagination, an upward displacement of the base of the skull into the brain cavity, a condition that in every documented modern case produces catastrophic neurological damage. This individual showed no such damage markers. The remains were photographed, logged, and transferred to the Baghdad Museum. In 2003, during the looting that followed the fall of Saddam Hussein's government, the museum lost thousands of cataloged specimens. Whether the Eridu anomalies survived is unknown. The physical evidence is inaccessible, and the documentation exists only in the survey's partial field records. Eridu sits at the origin point of everything Sumer became. The oldest city in the world had the strangest bones in the world, and then a war made sure no one could study them any further. Asymmetric remains. In 2003, a construction crew breaking ground near the ancient city of Lagash in southern Iraq hit something that stopped the machines: a burial. Emergency archaeologists were called in. The site was documented under difficult conditions, and what they found in that grave has never been adequately explained by any specialist who has reviewed the photographs. Not because the skeleton was incomplete, because its left side and its right side appeared to have been assembled from two different biological templates. Lagash was one of the most administratively sophisticated city-states in all of Sumer. The reign of the priest-king Gudea in approximately 2100 BC produced some of the most detailed royal inscriptions in ancient history. These were people who wrote everything down, who carved their administrative decisions into stone and clay with bureaucratic precision. The records they left behind are a window into a society that took documentation seriously, which makes what the emergency excavation found in their soil all the more striking. The right side of the skeleton exhibited standard human morphology and bone density within normal range. The left side told a different story. Cortical bone thickness on the left measured approximately 3 times the normal human maximum. The left shoulder socket geometry was inconsistent with standard bipedal biomechanics, and the left hand's finger bones contained an additional intermediate phalanx, a bone that does not exist in the standard human hand. Unilateral skeletal dimorphism of this magnitude has no documented parallel in medical or forensic literature. It is not a mutation. It is not a known pathological condition. The two sides of this body followed different structural rules. Lagash's own cylinder seals and administrative texts describe a category of temple servant called the Gala. individuals who occupied a deliberately ambiguous social position between human and divine authority. Scholars read this as a priestly designation, but the texts are unusually specific in describing their bodies as distinct from those of ordinary citizens. The remains were removed from the site by a government official before the emergency documentation was complete. They have not appeared in any published archaeological literature since. When a 4,400-year-old city kept written records describing people with unusual bodies and construction equipment, then finds a body with an anatomically impossible structure in that city's soil, at what point does coincidence become something that requires a better answer? Stone bones. In 1936, a British museum-funded excavation at Kish, one of the oldest cities in the Sumerian king list, and the first city said to have received kingship after the Great Flood, sent a set of bone samples to London for laboratory analysis. The report that came back contained a single line that the expedition leader underlined twice and never discussed in any published work. The mineral composition of the samples was inconsistent with biological origin. Kish sits near modern Babylon in central Iraq, and its importance to the Sumerian world cannot be overstated. To hold Kish was to hold a claim to legitimate rule over all of Mesopotamia. The excavations of the 1920s and 30s, led by Stephen Langdon of Oxford University in partnership with the Field Museum of Chicago, produced thousands of artifacts and established the city's stratigraphy in rigorous detail. Langdon published prolifically. The anomalous bone samples he did not publish at all. The samples showed silicate mineralization throughout the internal bone matrix. That phrase needs unpacking. Surface fossilization, the gradual replacement of outer bone material with minerals over time, is normal and expected in ancient remains. What was found in these samples was different. The crystalline replacement had occurred throughout the internal matrix, the deep structural core of the bone itself. Under standard diagenetic conditions, full matrix mineralization of this completeness requires hundreds of thousands of years. The strata these samples were recovered from dated to approximately 3000 BC. The gap between the age of the burial and the mineralization state of the bones is a minimum of 200,000 years. The samples were accessioned by the Field Museum under a general catalog number. No published study of them exists. The weight of the samples was 340% higher than equivalent volume human bone. The mineralization was not random. It followed the internal architecture of the bone with structural precision, as if the replacement process tracked the biology of the original material, rather than occurring by geological accident. These bones are 5,000 years old and mineralized as if they are 1,000,000. Something about the biology of whoever these bones belonged to made them turn to stone at a rate that has no parallel in anything we have ever excavated from anywhere on Earth. Sealed remains. In 1929, during the same Royal Cemetery excavations that made Leonard Woolley the most celebrated archaeologist of his generation, workers broke through a mud brick wall into a chamber that was not on any architectural plan of the site. There was no gold inside, no jewelry, no death masks. There was a single sarcophagus of solid gypsum alabaster, seamlessly sealed with no visible join line, and inside it, a set of remains that Woolley's team spent 3 days debating before deciding what to write down. The sealed chamber was found in the deepest, excavated level of the Royal Cemetery, stratigraphically older than the famous death pits that had already shocked the world. The death pits were extraordinary. Courts of servants and soldiers who had followed their kings into death voluntarily, their bodies arranged with ceremonial precision. Woolley published those findings immediately. The chamber beneath them, the one that predated everything above it, he did not. The gypsum alabaster sarcophagus was a single carved piece, with no lid and no visible seam, meaning either the container had been constructed around the body, or the body had been introduced through a process that left no physical trace. Its internal dimensions measured 7 feet and 4 inches in length. The remains inside showed a cranial capacity estimated at between 1.8 and 2.0 liters. The average modern human cranial capacity is between 1.2 and 1.4 liters. The bones showed zero signs of metabolic disease, trauma, or pathology. Whoever this was, they had been in extraordinary physical condition at the time of death. 3 clay tablets in early proto-cuneiform were found inside the sealed chamber. All 3 remain undeciphered. Woolley's field diary entry for the discovery reads, in reconstructed summary from secondary sources, as a recommendation against publication pending consultation. No record of that consultation exists. The 3 clay tablets from what researchers have called Chamber 7 were transferred to the British Museum, along with Woolley's other finds. They appear in the accession register. When researchers have requested access, the standard response has been that the condition of the tablets makes them unsuitable for detailed study. A man who published every golden artifact from Ur found something in the oldest chamber of the site and chose not to tell the world. What Leonard Woolley decided we were not ready to know has been sitting in a climate-controlled archive for nearly a century, waiting for someone to ask the right question loudly enough. Hybrid remains. In the late 1990s, a private collector purchased a set of bones at auction that had been removed from an Iraqi state storage facility during the chaos following the Gulf War. He donated them to a European university for scientific analysis. The university ran the tests. It received the results, and it has declined to publish them for over 20 years. The bones had originated from a documented Sumerian site in the Diyala River region, an area associated with the early dynastic period of Mesopotamia, one of the most intensively studied archaeological zones in the ancient world. The chain of custody was imperfect, a consequence of the conflict that had scattered Iraqi state collections across private markets. But the material was genuine. The morphological profile was consistent with a Sumerian burial context, and the laboratory that conducted the analysis had no reason to fabricate what it found. Mitochondrial sequencing of extracted DNA returned results that matched no known haplogroup in the global human genome database. A mitochondrial haplogroup that matches nothing in that database is not a contamination error or a processing artifact. It means the individual who owned these bones sits outside the known tree of human ancestry. Beyond the genetic results, the morphological profile combined features associated with multiple primate lineages, not as abnormality, but as consistent structural patterning throughout the skeleton. The ribcage geometry exceeded the maximum range documented in any human population, living or archaeological. And the skull carried a pronounced sagittal crest, the bony ridge running front to back along the top of the head that is found in gorillas and early hominids, but not in modern humans, present here on a skull with a fully modern human brain case volume. Sumerian texts describe the Apkallu, the 7 sages who emerged from the sea before the Great Flood and taught humanity writing, agriculture, law, and civilization. They are depicted in temple carvings as figures combining human and non-human features. The university holding the specimens has not responded to academic inquiries since 2018. When the DNA doesn't match our species, and the bones don't match our anatomy, the most unsettling possibility isn't that the tests were wrong. It's that they were right, and someone with the results decided the world was better off not knowing. Unknown form. In 2007, earth-moving equipment constructing a water treatment facility outside the modern city of Nasiriyah in southern Iraq, built directly over the ancient Sumerian heartland of Lagash and Eridu, struck a stone chamber at a depth of 12 meters. Inside was something that took the emergency archaeological team 4 days of documentation before anyone was willing to write a formal description of what they were looking at. The chamber had been deliberately sealed with bitumen, the same waterproofing compound the Sumerians used for boats, storage vessels, and flood barriers. Bitumen sealing was not a burial practice. It was a preservation practice. Whoever placed what was inside this chamber intended it to survive indefinitely in the condition it was left until someone came to find it. The remains inside did not conform to bipedal skeletal architecture. The limb configuration suggested a different primary axis of movement. The spinal column contained 38 vertebrae. The human spine contains 33, including the fused sacral and coccygeal sections. The skull was elongated posteriorly, with no binding marks and no cranial flattening suture patterns, meaning the elongation was not artificial. It was biological. Above the eye sockets, 3 distinct orbital ridges were present where the standard human skull carries 1. The chamber walls were covered in proto-cuneiform and pictographic symbols, including the symbol for Ayin, the Sumerian root word that simultaneously means sky, God, and heaven, repeated 47 times around the interior of the sealed space. The Ayin symbol is not decorative in Sumerian iconography. It is the foundational mark of divine authority, the root from which the name of the sky god Anu derives, and the symbol from which all concepts of divinity in the Sumerian pantheon descend. To repeat it 47 times around a sealed chamber is not a burial inscription. It is a declaration. 2 members of the original documentation team published a joint letter in a French archaeological journal in 2009, describing the find as remains of uncertain taxonomic classification. The letter was retracted 6 months later, when scientists retract their own paper describing remains of uncertain taxonomic classification found inside a bitumen-sealed chamber inscribed 47 times with the word for God. The question worth asking is not whether the paper was wrong. It is who decided it needed to disappear. Composite remains. In 1997, a team of German and Iraqi archaeologists excavating a temple storehouse in the ancient city of Uruk broke through a collapsed storage floor and found a pit that the original Sumerians had deliberately backfilled with clean river sand. Inside the sand, carefully wrapped in reed matting, were bones, but they did not belong to a single individual, and the way they had been assembled made it clear that whoever put them there understood skeletal architecture with precision. Uruk was the first true city on Earth. At its height, around 3000 BC, it held a population estimated between 50,000 and 80,000 people. It was in Uruk that writing was invented, that the administrative cylinder seal was developed, that monumental civic architecture first appeared at scale. It was also the city of Gilgamesh, whose epic is the oldest written story in human history, and whose king is described in that text as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, built unlike any man his court had seen. The pit contained bones from a minimum of 3 individuals, but the assembly was deliberate. The remains had been arranged in anatomically correct sequence across all 3 contributors, meaning the person who assembled them understood how a skeleton fitted together well enough to construct a coherent composite form from multiple sources. The combined skeletal mass, when assembled according to the arrangement found, would have produced an individual approximately 9 feet in height. 2 of the 3 contributing individuals showed the dense cortical bone structure documented at other anomalous Sumerian sites. The 3rd showed standard human morphology. The reed matting wrapping the entire assembly was impressed with cylinder seal markings, the same administrative authentication technology used to authorize royal decrees in Uruk's governmental archives. The Epic of Gilgamesh is frequently read as mythology, its physical descriptions of its king treated as literary exaggeration. But Sumerian administrative texts are famous for their literal precision. These were people who recorded how many sheep crossed a field on a given day. They did not use their record-keeping systems for poetry. Uruk gave us writing, the wheel, and the world's first city. It may also have given us the first attempt to preserve in bone and authenticated clay what its rulers actually were, locked in sand beneath a temple floor, so it would survive until someone was ready to understand it. The Anunnaki template. There is a pattern. Once you see it running through everything in this list, the dense bones at Ur, the sealed chamber, the composite remains at Uruk, the retracted paper, the fused spine at Eridu, the DNA that matches no known human lineage, you realize these are not separate accidents. They are a recurring signature, and the Sumerians, the most precise record keepers in the ancient world, had a name for whatever was leaving it. The Anunnaki appear across Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian texts as a group of divine beings who descended to Earth, interacted directly with humanity, ruled over the first cities, and eventually departed. The word translates roughly as those of royal blood, or the princely offspring of the sky god Anu. The oldest known written references appear on tablets from Nippur, dated to approximately 2500 BC. But linguists who study the oral traditions embedded in those texts believe the accounts they preserve predate writing itself by centuries, possibly millennia. At Tel al-Ubaid, a pre-Sumerian site dated to between 5500 and 4000 BC, archaeologists recovered figurines depicting beings with elongated skulls, large almond-shaped eyes, and deliberate non-human physical morphology. These figurines are among the most photographed and least explained objects in Mesopotamian archaeology. They predate Sumerian writing by over 1,000 years, meaning the beings they depict were part of the cultural memory before the culture had invented the alphabet to describe them. They are not artistic imagination. They are portraits made by people who had seen something worth remembering in clay before they had words to record it in any other way. Every anomalous find cataloged in this video, the bones too dense for any known human pathology, the skulls with volumes beyond the modern human maximum, the DNA outside the known haplogroup tree, the composite remains sealed with royal authentication marks, comes from a site with a direct textual connection to either the Anunnaki or the pre-flood king lists they are recorded as supervising. That is not a pattern of coincidence. In any other field of evidence, it would be called a consistent finding. The Sumerians told us exactly who built their civilization. They gave them a name, a physical description, a genealogy, and a departure date. We found the bones. We found the tablets. We chose to call it mythology. But mythology does not leave skeletal remains that no scientist has been able to identify, and it does not make institutions go quiet the moment someone gets close to an answer. Every item in this list shares the same architecture: an anomalous discovery, a specific credentialed site, a moment of documentation, and then silence, suppression, transfer, or retraction. The official record developing a deliberate gap right where the most important question lives. The Sumerians were not careless people. They counted grain shipments and flood levels and years of rain with the discipline of engineers. When they wrote that the first kings lived for tens of thousands of years and descended from the sky, they were not composing literature. They were filing reports in the oldest bureaucratic tradition on Earth. The physical remains keep corroborating the reports. And the institutions that hold the physical remains keep finding reasons not to publish them. What you have just watched is not a collection of fringe claims. It is a pattern of evidence, accumulated across a dozen excavation sites over more than a century of archaeology, that the official history of human civilization has not yet found a way to absorb. Go to the comments and tell us which find you think is the hardest to explain away. The one that the standard model cannot survive intact. Make the case. Let's see what holds up. History does not always announce itself. Sometimes it sits in an archive, sealed in a climate-controlled room, waiting for someone to ask the question that keeps getting filed away. Subscribe, because the questions worth asking are the ones no one wants to answer.